In this module, we're going to focus on the fifth tool PMs can use to generate more leverage, 4D roadmaps. One of the core pieces of work PMs do involves prioritizing product work into a product roadmap. However, they often rely on overly simplistic prioritization frameworks that lead to low-leverage product roadmaps. In this lesson, we'll introduce our approach to building a roadmap. This approach takes into account 4 different lenses of product development. But first, let's zoom out and start with a common definition for what a roadmap is, since teams can have different definitions. Then, let's discuss the issues with existing roadmap creation approaches. In our definition, roadmaps mean your plan for what initiatives you'll work on over a period of time, often 3 to 12 months. We don't use roadmaps to refer to your product strategy or vision, i.e. your high-level plan for how you win in the market, or the high-level answer to how your product will make the world a better place for your users. Next, let's examine how most teams create roadmaps today, and what these approaches' shortfalls are. To create and prioritize roadmaps, teams often use traditional prioritization frameworks, like one of the following approaches. These 2 approaches are voting-based prioritization and RICE, or scoring-based prioritization. An example of a voting-based approach might look like the following. First, the team brainstorms an initial list of possible initiatives. Then, the PM assigns each initiative a certain cost based on the estimated effort required to complete it. For example, if Initiative 1 were to take 10 person weeks of effort, you might set costs at $10. Then, assuming Initiatives 2 and 3 are 2 and 3 times as resource intensive as Initiative 1, their costs would be $20 and $30 respectively. Then, the PM gives each member on their team a cash allowance, representing how much capacity their team has. Let's assume there are 3 people on the team and 12 weeks in the quarter. This means everyone gets $36 to allocate. The team then votes for features by buying them with their cash allowance, representing how they'd choose to allocate team capacity if they were allowed full control. Person 1 might be really interested in seeing Initiatives 1 and 2 work out, but also care about Initiative 3. They spend $10 and $20 on Initiatives 1 and 2, and the rest on 3. In contrast, Person 2 might believe Initiative 3 is the only important one to focus on, and choose to fund that. Finally, Person 3 might only care about Initiatives 1 and 2, and choose to fund those. After allowing people to discuss and reallocate their budgets, the final purchases are tallied. The most bought initiatives are then prioritized. In this case, assuming no reallocation of funds, Initiatives 1 and 2 were bought most at 2 purchases each, compared to the 1.2 times purchase of Initiative 3. Therefore, Initiatives 1 and 2 would be prioritized. The second approach is scoring-based prioritization. Instead of allowing everyone an equal vote on what initiatives get prioritized, scoring-based prioritization objectively looks at what initiatives will have the most impact relative to the investment. This is done based on a calculation. The most well-known scoring-based prioritization approach is RICE, which scores initiatives on 4 factors. First is R, or reach. This is the number of users affected by the initiative, scored by total users affected. Let's say we have 3 hypothetical brainstormed initiatives. Initiatives 1 and 2 are widely applicable, but somewhat incremental initiatives. Initiative 3 is a more niche but large impact initiative. Quantifying this, Initiatives 1 and 2 might reach 500 users. Initiative 3 might reach slightly less at 300 users. Second is I, impact. This is the relative depth of impact the initiative would create for a user, scored on a scale of 0.25 to 3, minimal to massive impact. Using the same example, Initiative 1 might be a relatively low impact improvement, so it gets a 0.5. Initiative 2 might be a medium improvement, so it gets a 1. Initiative 3 is a large but not game-changing improvement, so it gets a 2. Third is C, confidence. This measures how much you believe in your estimates, on a scale of 50% to 100%. Continuing our example, Initiative 1 is a sure win, so it gets 100%. Initiative 2 is still fairly likely to succeed, but has some key risks, so let's give it 80%. Initiative 3 is a big bet, so it gets 50%. In our example, Initiatives 1, 2, and 3 might take 10, 20, and 30 person weeks, respectively, so their effort scores are exactly those. Each initiative receives a score, calculated as the product of reach times impact times confidence divided by effort. This would mean, in our hypothetical example, that Initiatives 1, 2, and 3 get a score of 25, 20, and 10, respectively. The initiatives are then sorted, with the highest scoring initiatives being the first candidates for prioritization. So, Initiative 1 would be prioritized over Initiative 2, which would be prioritized over Initiative 3. PMs use voting and RICE prioritization approaches because they add structure to an otherwise heavily judgment-based process. This structure does two things for them. First, it makes for a more informed prioritization process. Both voting and RICE don't rely on a single person's intuition, but rather use an external calibration process. Voting relies on multiple people's intuition for what will create the most impact. RICE tries to distill prioritization from art into pure science, with every initiative being evaluated using the same dimensions. Second, it makes defending roadmap decisions much easier. Because there's an agreed-upon process for prioritization decisions, there's a lower risk of people feeling like their ideas are being unfairly dismissed. In voting, there's a reassurance that initiatives are supported by a majority. In our example, the PM could point out that Initiatives 1 and 2 had the highest purchases. In RICE, there's a reassurance that initiatives are being objectively prioritized to achieve an optimal return. In our example, the PM could point to Initiatives 1 and 2 scoring objectively higher on the RICE calculation. However, despite their advantages, these approaches to road mapping still don't effectively create optimal leverage. They each have inherent biases in their approach that create risks for a lack of needle-moving work, suboptimal effort focus, and difficulty getting leadership buy-in. Let's start with the first missed leverage opportunity, needle-moving work. First, RICE and voting-based approaches both create a risk of low-impact work. This happens because these approaches tend to bias towards prioritizing incremental instead of needle-moving work. For RICE, the bias is created from how the score is calculated. Incremental initiatives tend to score high in confidence and low in effort, meaning they will generally score higher. For example, Initiative 1 has a high total RICE score despite relatively low impact. In contrast, needle-moving initiatives tend to be less sure wins, but the high effort and low confidence associated with them mean they tend to score low on RICE. As a result, they're often deprioritized. Initiative 3 in our example is a perfect illustration of this, with high impact being dragged down by low confidence and high effort. For voting, the incrementalism bias tends to come from psychology. Sachin Reiki says, teams tend to heavily bias towards the surefire wins in voting because they feel like safer successes. The problem is, safe successes aren't usually as needle-moving. To illustrate this, consider a case study of Patreon, a creator economy platform where users can buy monthly subscriptions to support their favorite creators. In 2019, Patreon completely overhauled their pricing model, going from a fixed 5% of sales to a tiered 5%, 8%, 12% pricing model, depending on the features and support their creators wanted from Patreon. This was a massive undertaking, requiring Patreon to completely repackage their product offerings and create new features to support higher tiers. Under a voting-based approach, it's unlikely that a given team would have chosen to undertake this initiative, which was highly complicated with an unquantified, uncertain return. It felt much safer, career-wise, to push for something that wasn't as risky. However, this risky bet was ultimately the right decision. Patreon ended up doubling its margins with no impact to acquisition or retention. The second risk of RICE and voting-based approaches is that they often end up creating unfocused roadmaps, losing a key source of leverage. Rice and voting approaches are often evaluating initiatives at an individual level. As a result, they may end up prioritizing a list of initiatives that are individually impactful, but may not cleanly work towards accomplishing the same objective. Scattering effort like this leads to suboptimal product outcomes. The clearest illustration of this is Yahoo. Originally just a search engine, Yahoo's roadmap over time grew to span multiple industries. Yahoo's level of focus became so thin that in 2006, Brad Garlinghouse, a Yahoo senior vice president, wrote a famous memo complaining about Yahoo's lack of focus. In what is now known as the Peanut Butter Manifesto, Garlinghouse pins Yahoo's decline squarely on lack of focus. He said, "I've heard our strategy described as spreading peanut butter. A thin layer of investment spreads across everything we do, and thus we focus on nothing in particular. I hate peanut butter. We all should." Although this is a company-level illustration, the same idea applies for PMs. Spreading effort across too many objectives results in the same lack of success in the few critical objectives. This lack of focus translates to losing a third key source of leverage: leadership buy-in. Leadership teams often find it easier to understand the high-level objectives behind roadmaps before they dig into individual initiatives. When individual initiatives do not cleanly ladder up to distinct objectives, it becomes a lot harder for leadership to understand the roadmap rationale. Sachin Reiki says, product leaders often complain that Rice and voting-based roadmaps lack a clear tie to product strategy or vision. As a result, it becomes less likely that the roadmap gets approved to work on. So to recap, so far we've talked about how traditional approaches like Rice and voting fail to create three critical sources of leverage: needle-moving work, focused effort, and leadership buy-in. To solve these problems, great PMs take a more focused, strategic approach to roadmap prioritization. In this module, we'll go into detail on exactly what that approach is and how it creates leverage. We'll call this approach 4D road mapping. 4D road mapping is a road mapping process that brainstorms roadmap initiatives from 4 different lenses, each with their unique strengths and weaknesses, and restricts and prioritizes those initiatives to only those that improve a specific set of metrics and objectives. The 4 lenses are strategy, what deeply aligns with your product strategy; vision, what gets you closer to realizing your vision; customer, what your users have explicitly requested; and business, what improves critical input metrics. It's these 4 lenses, along with the systematic decision to limit brainstorming, that help 4D road mapping create leverage in a way that Rice and voting typically do not. First, by actively considering and balancing work from these 4 lenses, you avoid the incrementalism bias that you typically have in Rice and voting. Instead, you move towards needle-moving work. 4D road mapping actively forces you to brainstorm and prioritize initiatives from your strategy and vision lens. This lens tends to be less incremental and more needle-moving. This is high leverage, because these initiatives would ordinarily be skipped over in Rice and voting due to their generally higher investment requirements, with less certain returns. Second, 4D road mapping forces you to constrain and prioritize your initiatives to only those that improve a specific set of objectives and KPIs. This creates focus in your work and makes it easier to get leadership buy-in. The 4D road mapping process restricts your ideas on 2 levels. First, you determine a set of target KPIs that all your brainstormed objectives must improve. Second, you limit all your initiatives that you finally implement to just those objectives. By constraining your ideas in a top-down way, you force all of your roadmap to be highly concentrated on improving just a couple of key areas. In other words, by constraining your ideas in this top-down fashion, you create leverage through focus. This contrasts sharply to Rice and voting, where you do a bottoms-up brainstorm of initiatives. This lack of top-down constraint means the brainstormed initiatives are more likely to relate to different objectives and improve a disparate set of metrics. This creates a lack of focus in the final roadmap. Additionally, the focus of the 4D road mapping process translates into another benefit. It gives you a much clearer and focused story to tell to leadership, making it easier to get their buy-in. Each initiative you implement will be part of a broader set of objectives, which all ladder up to the set of very specific KPIs you want to improve. Contrast this to RICE and voting-based approaches, which are much more likely to have an unfocused roadmap. This makes for an unfocused story to discuss with leadership. So now that we've established the benefits of the 4D road mapping process, let's dive into how to actually do it. In total, there are 3 steps. Step 1 is determine the KPIs you want to move. Here, you take the prioritized set of KPIs you identified in the Lever Dashboards module and align with leadership that those are the set of KPIs you should be working on. Step 2 is conduct a 4D constrained brainstorm. For each of the 4 lenses, you brainstorm a set of objectives and initiatives related to that lens. You constrain your brainstorm to only objectives and initiatives that are related to that lens. Step 3 is prioritize objectives and initiatives. Here, you prioritize your brainstormed objectives and initiatives to come up with your proposed roadmap. In this module, we'll walk through each of those steps in turn, but we'll first start off with a deep dive on the 4 lenses so that you understand the core idea of the 4D road mapping process. These are determining the KPIs you want to move and how to brainstorm objectives and initiatives for each lens.